Judge mocks black teen in court, shocked when he proves. He's a genius attorney in disguise. The gavel slammed down with a sharp crack, silencing the murmurs in the courtroom. Judge Walter Grayson leaned forward, his gaze fixed on the young man standing beside the defense table, his lips curled into a smirk, his voice dripping with condescension. "You really think you can defend yourself, kid? This isn't some high school debate. This is a court of law." Laughter rippled through the courtroom. The bailiff smirked. The stenographer barely suppressed a grin. Even the jury exchanged knowing glances. But Jalen Carter didn't flinch. His dark brown eyes locked onto Grayson's, unshaken. "With all due respect, Your Honor," he said calmly, slipping his hands into his pockets, "I understand the law well enough to know that laughing at a defendant isn't exactly professional judicial conduct." The courtroom went dead silent. The smirk disappeared from Grayson's face. No one had ever spoken to him like that. Jalen shifted his stance, his expression unreadable. "And if we're being honest, I think we both know that this case isn't about the law. It's about perception. You think I don't belong here? Not in this courtroom, and certainly not at this defense table." Grayson's fingers clenched around his gavel. "Watch yourself, Carter." But Jalen wasn't done. "Oh, I'm watching, Your Honor. Watching how a judge is already mocking a defendant before hearing any facts. Watching how a prosecutor presents a case without real evidence. Watching how everyone in this courtroom has already decided I'm guilty before I even say a word." He let the silence settle. "And I haven't even started yet." A ripple of unease spread through the room. The smirk on Prosecutor Mitchell Carrington's face faded just slightly. Grayson cleared his throat. "Enough theatrics. Let's get this over with." Jalen almost smiled. That was the judge's second mistake. Earlier that morning, Jalen sat in a dimly lit holding cell, his back against the cold metal bench. The weight of the situation pressed down on him. 19 years old, on trial for a crime he didn't commit. The charges? Grand theft auto and resisting arrest. The real crime? Being in the wrong place at the wrong time. Jalen had spent his entire life preparing for a moment like this, just not as a defendant. While most kids memorized basketball stats, he memorized case law. While his friends spent their weekends at parties, he spent his at the county courthouse, watching trials unfold. His mother, Denise Carter, had been a paralegal for over 20 years, and Jalen had absorbed everything she ever told him about the justice system's flaws. And now he was living it. The public defender assigned to him, Lisa Thornton, barely glanced up when he walked into the defense room an hour before trial. She looked exhausted, overworked, underpaid. "Listen, kid," she said, flipping through the case file. "Best thing you can do is take a plea deal. The DA is offering 18 months, but with good behavior, you could be out in a year." Jalen stared at her. "I didn't steal that car." Lisa let out a tired sigh. "Yeah, well, the system doesn't care. Your fingerprints were in the vehicle, and the officer's report says you ran. That's enough for a conviction." Jalen leaned forward. "The system might not care, but I do." Lisa finally met his gaze. Something in his expression made her pause. He wasn't scared like most of her clients. He wasn't desperate. He looked certain. "What exactly are you suggesting?" Jalen exhaled. "I'm going to represent myself." Lisa blinked. "Excuse me? You heard me?" She let out a short laugh. "Kid, I've been doing this for 15 years, and I can tell you right now, you don't want to do that." Jalen tilted his head. "How many clients have you represented who actually knew the law?" Lisa hesitated. "I've been studying criminal defense since I was 13, he continued. "I know this case better than anyone, and I know when a system is setting me up to fail." Lisa studied him for a long moment. Then she closed the case file and slid it across the table. You have 5 minutes to convince me you're serious. Now, standing in front of Judge Grayson, Jalen was ready. Carrington, the seasoned prosecutor, straightened his tie as he rose from his seat. Your Honor, the state will prove beyond any reasonable doubt that Jalen Carter was found inside a stolen 2022 Audi A6, attempted to evade law enforcement, and was arrested after a brief pursuit. He turned to the jury, his voice smooth, confident. The evidence speaks for itself. The defendant's fingerprints were found on the steering wheel. He ran from officers. The car was reported stolen mere hours before his arrest. He paused, flashing a smug smile. The defense may attempt to paint this as some grand misunderstanding. But let's be honest. What kind of innocent person runs? A few murmurs rippled through the gallery. Judge Grayson nodded approvingly. Then Jalen stepped forward. Your Honor, before I respond, I'd like to confirm something with the prosecution. Carrington barely glanced at him. Go ahead. You said Officer Daniel Ruiz personally saw me behind the wheel before I was arrested? Carrington exhaled, already annoyed. That's correct, Jalen nodded. And that's written in his report? Obviously. Jalen turned to Judge Grayson. Your Honor, I move to dismiss Officer Ruiz's testimony as evidence. A brief silence. Grayson frowned. On what grounds? Jalen pulled his hands from his pockets. Because Officer Ruiz never saw me in that car. Carrington let out a sharp laugh. That's ridiculous. Is it? Jalen turned to the gallery. Because I'd like to subpoena the GPS records from Officer Ruiz's patrol unit that night. If he was where he said he was, the data will confirm it. But, he let the words hang in the air. I have a feeling it won't. The murmurs grew louder. Grayson glanced at Carrington. Does the prosecution have any issue with verifying the GPS logs? Carrington hesitated, just long enough for the jury to notice. Jalen's lips curled into a faint smirk, the first crack in the case. Grayson sighed. Very well. We'll verify the GPS records. Jalen nodded, then turned to the jury. Ladies and gentlemen, the prosecution just told you their case is airtight, that their evidence is foolproof. But if their key witness wasn't even at the scene, then what else are they hiding? The tension in the room shifted. For the first time, the jury wasn't looking at Jalen like a criminal. They were looking at him like a lawyer, and this case was only just beginning. Jalen Carter leaned back slightly, his face unreadable as Judge Grayson tapped his gavel twice, signaling for order. The murmurs in the courtroom had grown into a low hum of tension, and even the most indifferent spectators were suddenly paying attention. Prosecutor Mitchell Carrington sat rigid in his chair, his jaw clenched as if grinding through the weight of what had just unfolded. The GPS records, if Jalen was right, would confirm that Officer Daniel Ruiz hadn't even been on scene when he claimed to have identified Jalen in the stolen car. It wasn't just a mistake in the prosecution's case. It was perjury. Carrington cleared his throat, standing with practiced composure. Your Honor, while we verify the officer's GPS records, I'd like to continue presenting the state's case. The defense has yet to explain how Mr. Carter's fingerprints were found on the stolen vehicle's steering wheel. Jalen smirked slightly. Oh, I'll get to that. Don't worry. Judge Grayson shot him a warning look. This is a courtroom, Mr. Carter, not a stage. Keep it professional. Jalen met his eyes steadily. Of course, Your Honor. I'd hate to make the prosecution uncomfortable by pointing out their inconsistencies too quickly. A faint chuckle rippled through the spectators. Carrington ignored it, turning toward the jury. Let's refocus on the facts. The defendant's fingerprints were found inside the stolen Audi. He was arrested near the location where the car was abandoned. He was seen running. He paused, letting the weight of his words settle. Those are not coincidences. Jalen stepped forward, his voice calm, controlled. "If I may, Your Honor." Grayson sighed. "Proceed." Jalen turned to the jury. "What the prosecution isn't telling you is how fingerprints actually work in a criminal investigation." He paced slightly, his gaze moving between the jurors. "They want you to believe that just because my prints were found on the car, that means I stole it. But here's the problem with that logic." He stopped, hands still in his pockets. "Let's say you walk into a department store and try on a jacket. You zip it up, adjust the sleeves, then put it back on the rack. Later, someone steals that jacket." He paused, watching their faces. "If the police find your fingerprints on it, does that mean you stole it?" Silence. A few jurors exchanged uncertain glances. Jalen let the question hang for a moment before continuing. "The truth is, we leave fingerprints on things all the time, without stealing them, and in my case there's a very simple explanation." Carrington crossed his arms. "Please enlighten us." Jalen turned toward him, his expression almost amused. "Gladly." He exhaled, leveling his gaze at the courtroom. "That night, I was at a 7-Eleven with friends. The car in question was parked outside, engine running, door slightly open. I leaned on it, maybe even touched the handle. Out of curiosity, I peeked inside." He let his words settle. "But I never got in. I never drove it. I never stole it." Carrington let out a short, dismissive laugh. "So let me get this straight. Your explanation is that you just happened to touch the stolen car, then just happened to be in the area when police arrested you." Jalen shrugged. "You tell me. Because while we're on the topic, let's talk about when I was arrested. What time was that again?" Carrington frowned slightly. "Approximately 11:27 p.m. Jalen nodded. "And what time did Officer Ruiz claim to see me behind the wheel?" Carrington stiffened. "Around 11:15 p.m. Jalen turned to Judge Grayson. "Your Honor, I'd like to request time-stamped security footage from the 7-Eleven parking lot, which will show exactly where I was at 11:15 p.m. The murmurs in the courtroom swelled. Carrington's face darkened. Grayson tapped his gavel. "Does the prosecution object?" Carrington hesitated just a fraction too long. "We don't believe this footage is relevant." "It either proves I was there or it doesn't," Jalen cut in smoothly. "So why hesitate?" The jury was watching Carrington now. They noticed. Grayson sighed. "Motion granted. The footage will be submitted." Jalen's heart pounded in his chest, but he kept his expression cool. Step by step, the case was falling apart. 15 minutes later, the footage was brought in. A large screen flickered to life, displaying grainy surveillance video from the 7-Eleven's parking lot. There, clear as day, was Jalen Carter, standing outside the store, laughing with his friends at 11:15 p.m., the exact moment when Officer Ruiz claimed to have seen him behind the wheel. The entire room shifted. Carrington visibly paled. Judge Grayson rubbed his temple. "Counselor?" Carrington's lips parted, but no words came. Jalen turned to the jury, his voice calm but firm. "So, either I've mastered the ability to be in two places at once," he let the sentence hang, "or Officer Ruiz lied in his report." A sharp breath was heard in the gallery. The jurors were now leaning in. Jalen's mother, Denise, sitting quietly in the back row, exhaled slowly. Grayson's jaw tightened. "We'll need to verify these findings." Jalen turned back toward the prosecution table. "By all means, Your Honor. Take your time. I've got all day." Carrington looked ready to throw something. Grayson turned to the prosecutor. "I assume you're still proceeding with your argument, despite the growing contradictions?" Carrington hesitated, then stood stiffly. "Your Honor, while this discrepancy is unfortunate, the fact remains," Jalen cut him off effortlessly, "that the entire foundation of your case is based on false testimony." The jury wasn't laughing anymore. Neither was Judge Grayson. Carrington cleared his throat, ignoring him. Regardless, the state still has compelling evidence, Jalen smirked. Like the fingerprints? Carrington hesitated. Jalen gestured toward the screen. We just saw proof that I wasn't in the car at the time of the theft. So tell me, when were my fingerprints found? Carrington flipped through his notes. Jalen nodded. Allow me to help you out. According to your own forensic report, my prints were collected from the car after it was abandoned. He turned to the jury. Meaning that I wasn't caught inside the car. I wasn't arrested near it. My prints weren't found at the time of the theft, but rather after it was already stolen and dumped. Which begs the question. Jalen turned to Carrington, his expression dangerously sharp. If I wasn't seen stealing the car, I wasn't in it, and I wasn't arrested anywhere near it, then why am I even standing here? The courtroom exploded. Grayson slammed his gavel. Order! Jalen stood still, his hands back in his pockets, while the entire weight of the moment crashed over the prosecution. Judge Grayson exhaled slowly, tapping his gavel twice. This trial isn't over, he said, but his voice lacked its usual confidence. Because everyone in that room already knew the truth. Jalen wasn't just fighting for himself. He was exposing the system, and he was winning. The air inside the courtroom had shifted. The tension that once felt dismissive, condescending, was now dense with uncertainty. The spectators were no longer laughing. The jury wasn't just listening. They were paying attention. Judge Walter Grayson sat with his jaw clenched, flipping through the case file as if searching for a way to regain control. Jalen Carter had just dismantled a cornerstone of the prosecution's case, and everyone knew it. From the prosecution table, Mitchell Carrington kept his hands folded tightly, knuckles slightly pale. He had been in courtrooms for over a decade. He had seen defendants try to play smart. Some even knew a thing or two about the law. But this was different. Jalen wasn't just poking holes in the case. He was tearing it apart at the seams. Jalen stood at the defendant's table, his hands resting in his pockets. Unbothered. Steady. His mother, Denise Carter, sat near the back of the room, silent but watching. He could feel her eyes on him. He was fighting for more than himself today. Judge Grayson sighed, rubbing his temple. All right, we'll review the GPS and surveillance evidence further. However, let's not waste time. Prosecution, you may proceed with your case. Carrington cleared his throat, taking the smallest moment to collect himself. His expression smoothed back into practiced authority. He wasn't going to let a teenager humiliate him twice in one trial. The state maintains that the defendant was found near the abandoned vehicle, and his flight from the police suggests guilt, Carrington said, standing with renewed confidence. Jalen raised an eyebrow. My flight from the police? Carrington turned to the jury. The defendant was seen running when officers arrived at the scene. An innocent man doesn't run. Jalen let out a quiet laugh, shaking his head slightly. Judge Grayson shot him a warning look. Something funny, Mr. Carter? Jalen exhaled through his nose, shaking his head again. Just amazed at how fast assumptions turn into facts in this courtroom. He turned toward the jury, his tone shifting slightly, pulling them in. Let me explain something. Let's say you're walking down the street, minding your own business. Suddenly, a police cruiser pulls up fast, lights flashing. Maybe you don't know why they're stopping you. Maybe you've seen what happens to people like you when cops assume things. So what do? He let the question sit for a second, then shrugged. Maybe you freeze. Maybe you walk faster. Maybe, just maybe, you run. Not because you're guilty, but because you're scared. A few jurors shifted in their seats. Carrington scoffed. So now you're suggesting you were afraid of the police? Jalen turned to him, eyes sharp. Is that so hard to believe? Silence. Jalen exhaled slowly, keeping his voice measured. If fear equals guilt, then we've got a bigger problem than this trial. Judge Grayson cleared his throat, tapping his gavel lightly. Stick to the case, Mr. Carter. Jalen nodded, slipping his hands back into his pockets. Of course, Your Honor. Carrington forced a smirk, but there was tension behind it. The jury should note that while the defendant is talented in wordplay, we're here to deal with evidence, not theatrics. Jalen gestured toward the prosecution's table. Then let's do exactly that. His voice lowered slightly, but the intensity rose. Prosecution claims I was caught fleeing the scene. But where exactly was I when police stopped me? Carrington frowned. Approximately 3 blocks away from where the vehicle was abandoned. Jalen nodded, slowly pacing toward the jury. And do you have video evidence of me running? Carrington paused. Jalen pressed forward. Dash cam footage? Street surveillance? Carrington clenched his jaw. There is an officer's written report. Jalen turned to Judge Grayson. Your Honor, if video footage of me fleeing exists, the prosecution should provide it. Silence. Grayson leaned forward slightly. Does the prosecution have such footage? Carrington hesitated 1 second too long. No. The tension in the room shifted again. Jalen turned toward the jury, speaking directly to them now. So, let's break this down. He held up one finger. 1. Officer Ruiz lied about seeing me behind the wheel. A second finger. 2. The only evidence that I ran is an officer's word, with no video proof. A third finger. 3. We now know my fingerprints were found after the car was abandoned, not during the theft. Jalen lowered his hand, his expression calm. So tell me, where's the actual case against me? The room was deathly silent. Judge Grayson exhaled sharply, gripping the edge of his bench. Counselor, how do you wish to proceed? Carrington shifted stiffly, his confidence shaken but not gone. The fact remains, he said carefully. The defendant's fingerprints were found on the stolen vehicle. The jury should still consider. Jalen cut in smoothly. Let's talk about those prints. Carrington clenched his jaw. We already have. No, we haven't, Jalen said, his voice sharper now. Because the one person who hasn't testified is the forensic specialist who examined those prints. Carrington stiffened. Jalen smirked slightly. You didn't call them to the stand, did you? Carrington's silence was louder than words. Jalen turned to Judge Grayson. Your Honor, the prosecution has submitted fingerprint evidence but failed to bring in an expert witness to verify the chain of custody, the collection method, or the potential for transfer contamination. Grayson's face darkened slightly. Counselor, why wasn't the forensics examiner called? Carrington's voice was tighter now. It was deemed unnecessary. Jalen raised an eyebrow. Unnecessary? He let out a dry laugh, shaking his head. So the prosecution built their case on fingerprints but didn't think it was necessary to verify them under oath? A few jurors exchanged glances. Jalen turned fully toward Judge Grayson, his tone deadly calm. I move to have the fingerprint evidence excluded due to lack of verification. Gasps rippled through the gallery. Carrington immediately objected. Your Honor! Grayson held up a hand. Enough! The judge was clearly frustrated now. He rubbed his forehead deep in thought. Finally, he sighed. Motion to exclude is under review. We will reconvene tomorrow after further examination. Jalen nodded, stepping back, but he already knew. The case was crumbling. Carrington looked furious. Judge Grayson was shaken. And for the first time, the jury wasn't looking at Jalen as a suspect. They were looking at him as someone they might actually believe. The next morning, the air inside the Los Angeles County Courthouse was charged with tension. Word had spread fast. What should have been an open and shut case had turned into a legal spectacle. Jalen Carter had exposed a critical flaw in the prosecution's case, and everyone knew it. As soon as he walked into the courtroom, he could feel the shift. The mocking glances from the bailiffs were gone. The whispers in the gallery had changed. This wasn't just about his case anymore. People were watching closely now. Judge Grayson sat at his bench, a deep furrow between his brows. He tapped his gavel lightly. Court is now in session. Mr. Carrington, do you have an update regarding the forensics testimony? Mitchell Carrington stood slowly, his usual confidence dimmed. Your Honor, he began, after reviewing the matter, we acknowledge that the forensic specialist was not originally called to testify. However, he held up a file. We have rectified this. I am calling forensic analyst Rebecca Langley to the stand. Jalen watched as a woman in her late 40s stepped up. She looked professional, but there was a flicker of unease in her eyes. Good. That meant she knew. Once Langley was sworn in, Carrington wasted no time. Ms. Langley, you were responsible for processing the fingerprints in this case, correct? Yes, she nodded. And can you confirm that the defendant's prints were found on the steering wheel of the stolen vehicle? Yes, she said again. Carrington turned to the jury, confidence creeping back into his voice. There you have it, ladies and gentlemen. The defendant's fingerprints were on the steering wheel. Jalen leaned forward, his face unreadable. His moment was coming. Carrington continued, And are you confident in your analysis? Langley hesitated for just a second before nodding. Yes. Jalen stood. Your Honor, I would like to cross-examine the witness. Judge Grayson sighed, rubbing his temple. Proceed, Mr. Carter. Jalen stepped forward, his hands in his pockets. His tone was even, but his eyes were sharp. Ms. Langley, you say my prints were on the steering wheel. Correct. Jalen nodded. And just to clarify, did your analysis determine when those prints were placed there? Langley froze. Carrington shifted slightly. Jalen continued, not giving her room to recover. Let me ask it another way. Can fingerprints tell us when someone touched a surface? Langley cleared her throat. Number fingerprints can remain on a surface for days, even weeks, depending on conditions. Jalen turned to the jury, letting that statement settle. Then he turned back to Langley. So, you're saying there is no way to confirm whether I touched that wheel before the car was stolen or after it was abandoned? Langley swallowed hard. That's correct. Jalen's lips curled slightly. Interesting. He turned to Judge Grayson. Your Honor, given this information, I move to have the fingerprint evidence excluded, as it does not prove when, or even if, I was inside the vehicle during the crime. Carrington shot up from his seat. Objection. The presence of fingerprints is still valid evidence. Jalen nodded, but his voice cut through the tension. Then by that logic, if my prints were found on a public bench, does that mean I live there? A few jurors exchanged glances. Carrington's jaw tightened. Judge Grayson sighed heavily, his fingers drumming against the bench. He didn't like this. Not because Jalen was wrong, but because he was right. After a long pause, Grayson finally spoke. The court acknowledges that the fingerprint evidence, while relevant, is inconclusive in determining guilt. Jalen tilted his head slightly, reading between the lines. Grayson wasn't fully admitting defeat, but he was backing away from Carrington's argument, which meant one thing. The case was crumbling. Jalen returned to his seat, satisfied. He felt his mother's eyes on him from the back of the room. She was proud, but also worried. She had spent her entire career watching trials like these. She knew that when a defendant like Jalen started winning, the system didn't just roll over. It fought back. Carrington was already moving to Plan B. If I may, Your Honor, he said, turning back toward the judge. While the fingerprint evidence is under review, I would like to redirect focus to a more damning piece of evidence. Jalen exhaled slowly. Here we go. Carrington's voice darkened slightly. The defendant's prior criminal record. Murmurs rippled through the gallery. Judge Grayson adjusted his glasses, studying Carrington. You're bringing up a prior record. Carrington nodded, his expression firm. Yes, Your Honor. While the defense would have you believe Mr. Carter is an innocent teenager wrongfully accused, I believe the jury should be aware that this is not his first encounter with law enforcement. Jalen's stomach tightened, but his face remained neutral. Your Honor, Carrington continued, Jalen Carter has a juvenile record, sealed under standard privacy laws. However, I am filing a motion to unseal those records, as they directly pertain to his character and likelihood of committing this crime. Jalen heard his mother inhale sharply from the back of the room. Judge Grayson leaned back, his fingers steepled. Mr. Carter, do you have any objections to this motion? Jalen stood slowly, his calm facade unshaken. Yes, Your Honor, he said. Grayson nodded. Then present your case. Jalen took a breath, turned toward the jury, and spoke clearly. The prosecution wants to unseal my juvenile records to convince you that I am a criminal. But what he won't tell you is what's actually in those records. A few jurors leaned forward slightly. Jalen continued, not looking away. When I was 15, I was arrested for a crime I didn't commit. The gallery grew even quieter. Jalen turned to Judge Grayson. Your Honor, before the court makes a ruling, I'd like to submit an official statement from the arresting officer in that case. Carrington's head snapped up. What? Jalen didn't break eye contact with Grayson. In this statement, the officer admits that my previous arrest was based on misidentification, which means my record isn't proof of criminal behavior. He turned slightly, letting the weight of his words settle. It's proof of systemic bias. A low ripple spread through the room. Carrington looked panicked now. Your Honor, this is highly irrelevant. Grayson held up a hand. Mr. Carter, this is a serious claim. Are you saying your juvenile record contains an admission of wrongful arrest? Jalen nodded. Yes, Your Honor, and I can prove it. Grayson's expression darkened. He turned to Carrington, who was visibly sweating now. Mr. Carrington, the judge said slowly, did you know about this prior misidentification? Carrington stammered. Your Honor, Grayson raised a hand, cutting him off. This court will recess for review before any further discussion of Mr. Carter's past record. Jalen exhaled slowly. He had just turned Carrington's own move against him. As he sat down, he felt his mother's gaze on him. This time, she wasn't just worried, she was impressed. The courtroom doors swung open, and the sound of murmurs filled the air. The atmosphere was different now, tense, uncertain. The trial was no longer a formality. It was a battle. Jalen Carter sat at the defense table, his hands clasped together, his face unreadable. His strategy had worked. He had forced the court to acknowledge its own flaws. But this wasn't the end. He could feel it. The prosecution wasn't going to go down without a fight. Judge Grayson entered the room, looking visibly frustrated. He adjusted his glasses, then glanced at Carrington, who had spent the recess scrambling to recover from Jalen's last move. Mr. Carrington, Grayson said, before we continue, has the prosecution reviewed the defendant's previous record? Carrington cleared his throat, shifting slightly. He had spent the last hour trying to spin the situation, but there was no clean way out. Yes, Your Honor, he said carefully. And while it is true that Mr. Carter's juvenile record includes an admission of wrongful arrest, we still maintain that his current charges are separate from his past. Jalen leaned forward slightly, his voice calm. So, let me get this straight. You wanted to use my juvenile record against me, but now that it proves I was falsely accused, you want to pretend it doesn't matter? A ripple of murmurs spread through the courtroom. Carrington's jaw tightened. Objection, he snapped. That is a misrepresentation. Judge Grayson raised a hand, cutting him off. Enough. The court has already ruled that Mr. Carter's juvenile record will not be used as character evidence. Jalen sat back, but he wasn't done yet. Your Honor, he said smoothly, before we move on, I'd like to submit a motion for an internal review of how this case was handled, from the moment of my arrest to the evidence presented in this courtroom. Grayson's eyes narrowed slightly. And what exactly are you alleging, Mr. Carter? Jalen exhaled slowly, carefully choosing his words. I believe this case was built on confirmation bias, Your Honor. The moment I was arrested, law enforcement assumed I was guilty, and every decision after that was made to fit that assumption. Judge Grayson studied him for a long moment, his expression unreadable. Then he did something no one expected. Motion granted, he said. Carrington's head snapped up. Your Honor, that's highly unusual. Grayson shot him a warning look. Perhaps, but given what we've seen so far, I'd rather be thorough than reckless. Jalen fought the urge to smirk. He had just won another round. Carrington took a slow breath, regaining his composure. He wasn't giving up. If anything, Jalen could see the determination in his eyes. Very well, Carrington said, flipping through his notes. Then I'd like to move forward with our next witness, Officer Daniel Ruiz. The bailiff opened the door and Ruiz walked in. Jalen watched him closely. The officer was nervous. Jalen could tell by the way he adjusted his badge, the way his eyes flickered around the room, the slight tension in his jaw. He was hiding something. Ruiz was sworn in, then Carrington wasted no time. Officer Ruiz, can you describe the events of the night in question? Ruiz cleared his throat. Yes, sir. I was part of the response team that received the call about a stolen vehicle. When I arrived at the scene, I was given a description of the suspect and joined the pursuit. I witnessed the defendant being apprehended and placed under arrest. Carrington nodded. And to confirm, you saw the defendant in the stolen vehicle? Yes, Ruiz said. Jalen smiled to himself. There it was. The lie. Jalen stood. Your Honor, may I cross-examine the witness? Judge Grayson sighed. Proceed, Mr. Carter. Jalen walked up slowly, his hands in his pockets, his gaze unshaken. Officer Ruiz, I appreciate your testimony, he began. But I have a few questions for you. Ruiz nodded stiffly. Jalen took a slow step forward. You said you were part of the response team. Can you tell us exactly when you arrived at the scene? Ruiz hesitated. I got there shortly after the pursuit began. Jalen tilted his head slightly. Shortly after? That's vague. Let me be more specific. Did you arrive before or after the suspect was already detained? Ruiz hesitated just a fraction too long. After, he admitted. Jalen nodded, feigning innocence. I see. So when you testified that you saw me in the vehicle, you were relying on information provided by other officers, correct? Ruiz's jaw tightened. Carrington shifted uncomfortably. Technically, yes, Ruiz admitted. Jalen turned to the jury, his voice sharp and controlled. So, to summarize, Officer Ruiz did not actually see me in the stolen vehicle. He was simply told that I had been in it. A hushed silence fell over the room. Carrington jumped in immediately. Objection! This is twisting the facts. Overruled, Judge Grayson said, rubbing his temple. Mr. Carter is simply clarifying the witness's statement. Jalen wasn't finished. Officer Ruiz, when you arrived, you said you were given a description of the suspect. Do you recall exactly what that description was? Ruiz looked uneasy now. Male, black, early 20s, wearing a hoodie. Jalen smiled faintly. See, that's interesting because I was wearing a t-shirt and jeans that night. Ruiz stiffened. The jury took notice. Jalen's voice lowered, sharp as a knife. Would you say that's an accurate match? Ruiz looked at Carrington, but there was no escape. No, he admitted. Jalen let the moment sink in. The prosecution's key witness had just discredited himself. Judge Grayson pinched the bridge of his nose. Officer Ruiz, if you were given an inaccurate suspect description, did you attempt to verify Mr. Carter's involvement before the arrest? Ruiz's lips parted slightly, but no words came out. Carrington intervened quickly. Your Honor, if I may. Grayson cut him off. I've heard enough. Mr. Carter, do you have any further questions for this witness? Jalen paused, looking directly at Ruiz. Then he shook his head. No further questions, Your Honor. Ruiz stood to leave, his face pale. Carrington had lost control of the trial. Jalen had proven that the case against him was built on assumptions, not facts. But he wasn't done yet. Not even close. Judge Grayson rubbed his temple, then turned to Carrington. Mr. Carrington, you may call your next witness, he said, his voice heavier now. But everyone in the room could feel it. The tide had turned. And for the first time, Judge Grayson looked at Jalen not as a defendant, but as a real contender in this courtroom. The courtroom was silent, but the weight of what had just happened echoed through the air. The prosecution was on the ropes, and everyone knew it. Jalen Carter sat still, his hands folded on the table, his expression unreadable. But inside he could feel it. The shift. For the first time since the trial began, Judge Grayson wasn't smirking. He was watching Jalen carefully, as if finally recognizing that this wasn't just another case. This was a reckoning. Carrington cleared his throat, flipping through his notes with shaky hands. He was unraveling, and it was obvious. He had already lost his key witness, and now the jury was looking at him like he was the one on trial. He needed a new strategy. Your Honor, Carrington said, forcing confidence into his voice, while the defense is certainly skilled at theatrics, the evidence against Mr. Carter remains clear. The stolen vehicle was abandoned just blocks from where the defendant was arrested. His fingerprints were found inside the car. These facts do not change. Jalen exhaled slowly. He knew Carrington wasn't wrong, but he also knew the case was built on a flimsy foundation. It was time to shatter it completely. Your Honor, Jalen said smoothly, if I may respond. Grayson nodded, rubbing his temple. Proceed, Mr. Carter. Jalen stood, buttoning his jacket with slow precision. He could feel every eye in the room locked on him, waiting. He turned to the jury, making sure to meet their gazes one by one. The prosecution is asking you to focus on a single piece of evidence. The fingerprints, he said, his voice calm, controlled. But what they fail to mention is that fingerprints don't tell you when they were left behind. A murmur spread through the room. Carrington's face twitched slightly. Jalen kept going. Let's say I borrow my friend's car and touch the steering wheel. If that car is stolen a week later, do my prints suddenly mean I stole it? A few jurors nodded slightly, absorbing the logic. The prosecution wants you to believe that fingerprints alone prove guilt, Jalen continued. But they don't tell you how or when I touched that car. And that distinction? He tilted his head slightly. That's the difference between the truth and a conviction built on assumptions. Judge Grayson leaned back, his fingers tapping against the bench. Carrington wasn't done yet. Your Honor, he said, let's not ignore the fact that Mr. Carter was seen near the crime scene. That alone raises suspicion. Jalen let out a short chuckle, shaking his head. Suspicion isn't proof, Mr. Carrington, he said. And speaking of proof, he turned back to Judge Grayson. Your Honor, I'd like to submit new evidence into the record. Grayson's eyebrows lifted slightly. New evidence? Jalen nodded. Yes, Your Honor. The traffic camera footage from the gas station where the car was allegedly stolen. The courtroom stirred immediately. Carrington's face lost color. Grayson adjusted his glasses. Are you telling me this footage was not reviewed by the prosecution? Jalen's smile was razor-sharp. Seems like an oversight, doesn't it? he said smoothly. Judge Grayson turned to Carrington, his patience wearing thin. "Mr. Carrington?" Carrington hesitated, his fingers gripping the edge of the table. "We did not believe it was necessary," he said through clenched teeth. The jury's reaction was immediate. Carrington had just admitted that the prosecution ignored key evidence. Jalen walked back to the defense table, grabbing a USB drive from his folder. "I'd like to show the court the footage now," he said. Grayson sighed but nodded. "Very well. Let's see it." The bailiff took the USB and plugged it into the courtroom's large monitor. The screen flickered to life. The footage played. A white sedan pulled up to the gas station. The driver stepped out, a tall man wearing a hoodie. He left the car running as he walked inside the store. A few seconds passed. Then a different figure approached the vehicle, a man wearing a ski mask. He slipped into the driver's seat, shifted the car into drive, and sped off. Jalen was nowhere in the video. The entire courtroom erupted. Carrington's face went pale. Judge Grayson sat up straighter, his eyes narrowing. Jalen waited a moment, letting the weight of the revelation settle. Then he turned slowly to the prosecution. "Mr. Carrington," he said, his voice calm but lethal. "If the prosecution had reviewed this footage, would you have still charged me with grand theft auto?" Carrington said nothing. Jalen pressed. "Let me rephrase. If you had done your due diligence, would we even be having this trial right now?" Carrington opened his mouth, but no words came out. The jury was watching him, their faces full of doubt. Judge Grayson let out a long, slow sigh, rubbing his temples. "Mr. Carrington," he said, "do you wish to proceed with this case?" A long pause, then, "No, Your Honor." The words fell flat in the silent room. Jalen relaxed his shoulders. He had just won. Judge Grayson looked at Jalen, his expression unreadable. "You're an interesting one, Mr. Carter," he muttered. Jalen didn't blink. "Thank you, Your Honor." But he wasn't done yet, because while he had proven his own innocence, there was still one final move to make, and in the next chapter the entire justice system was going to feel it. Jalen Carter stood in the middle of the courtroom, letting the silence stretch as he locked eyes with the judge. Judge Grayson, the same man who had mocked him, now looked at him differently. The usual smugness was gone, replaced by something that almost resembled caution. The prosecution had already fallen apart. Carrington had no fight left in him. The jury had seen the truth, and now the judge had a choice to make. Jalen wasn't just defending himself anymore. He was about to expose the system. He stepped forward, keeping his voice steady. "Your Honor, before we conclude this case, I'd like to file a formal motion." Judge Grayson blinked. "A motion? For what?" Jalen exhaled, placing his hands on the defense table. "For judicial misconduct and prosecutorial negligence." The courtroom erupted. Gasps echoed through the gallery. Even the stenographer paused, fingers hovering over her keyboard. Carrington's face drained of color. Judge Grayson's jaw tightened. "Mr. Carter, I would advise you to tread carefully," Grayson warned. "You just had your case dismissed. If you're looking to push your luck—" Jalen didn't flinch. "This isn't about luck, Your Honor," he said. "It's about justice." Grayson leaned forward, his expression unreadable. "You're accusing me of misconduct?" Jalen nodded, his tone unwavering. "Yes, and I have evidence to support my claim." The tension in the room spiked. Jalen walked to the court's display monitor, plugging in another USB drive. The screen flickered. "This," he said, "is a list of cases presided over by Judge Walter Grayson in the last 3 years." On the screen, dozens of case numbers and defendant names appeared. Jalen tapped the screen. "And this," he continued, "is the conviction rate for black and white defendants under his rulings." The numbers didn't lie. A clear disparity. Black defendants received harsher sentences, had fewer cases dismissed, and were far more likely to be denied fair hearings. A murmur swept through the gallery. Judge Grayson's expression darkened. This is a courtroom, not an activist rally. This information is irrelevant. Jalen shook his head. No, Your Honor, it's not. It's pattern evidence. It shows a bias in your rulings that is statistically impossible to ignore. And it raises serious questions about your impartiality in my case. Grayson gritted his teeth, gripping the bench so hard his knuckles turned white. Jalen kept pushing. And let's not forget the prosecution, he continued, turning toward Carrington. Mr. Carrington withheld exculpatory evidence, the gas station footage, that could have prevented this entire trial. If I hadn't represented myself, I would have been convicted for a crime I didn't commit. Carrington tried to speak, but nothing came out. Jalen let the weight of his words settle before delivering the final blow. This trial was never about seeking justice, he said. It was about a system that's more focused on convictions than the truth. But today, he paused, scanning the room. The truth won. The jury was nodding. Some in the gallery were whispering. And then, the door to the courtroom opened. A group of reporters and cameras flooded in. Jalen smiled to himself. Because he had made one last phone call before stepping into court that morning, he had invited the press. Judge Grayson saw them enter, and for the first time he looked rattled. "This is a closed proceeding," he barked. "Actually, Your Honor," one of the reporters called out, holding up a document. "This is a public hearing, and we have every right to be here." Carrington looked panicked. Judge Grayson looked cornered. The entire courtroom was watching, waiting for his next move. Jalen stepped back, arms crossed, letting the judge wallow in the weight of his own mistakes. There was nothing he could do now. The system had tried to break him. Instead, he had broken the system. The courtroom was no longer just a place of judgment. It had become a battlefield. Jalen Carter stood firm at the defense table, his presence commanding the room. The prosecution was in shambles, the judge exposed, and the media had arrived just in time to witness the unraveling of a rigged system. Judge Grayson rubbed his temples, his confidence fractured. He had spent years controlling this courtroom, treating cases like nothing more than routine paperwork. But today, he wasn't in control. Jalen was. The young defendant-turned-defense attorney had dismantled everything, exposing not just the weaknesses in his own case, but the corruption within the entire judicial process. Jalen turned to the gallery, scanning the room full of reporters, legal professionals, and everyday citizens who had come expecting a quick conviction, but instead had witnessed the truth. "Your Honor," Jalen said, keeping his voice steady, "the facts are clear. The prosecution withheld evidence. The judge overseeing this trial has a documented history of bias. And yet, I, a 19-year-old with no law degree, had to be the one to expose it." He turned to face Mitchell Carrington, the prosecutor, who sat stiffly at his desk, his face ashen. "Tell me, Mr. Carrington," Jalen continued, "if I hadn't defended myself today, if I had accepted the public defender's advice and pleaded guilty, how long would you have let this go on?" Carrington looked away. Jalen's fury simmered beneath his calm demeanor. "Would you have cared that I was innocent, or was I just another easy conviction?" The tension crackled. The reporters' pens scratched furiously against their notepads. The judge shifted uncomfortably in his chair. And then Jalen delivered the final blow. "I move to file a formal complaint against this court, against the prosecution, and against every single officer who played a role in fabricating this case." Gasps rippled through the courtroom. Judge Grayson's gavel slammed down hard, but his voice faltered. "That is out of line." Jalen cut him off. "What's out of line is allowing cases like mine to happen every single day," he shot back. "What's out of line is a system that prioritizes conviction rates over the truth. What's out of line is the fact that I had to fight to prove my innocence, while the real criminal, the person who actually stole that car, is still out there, free. Silence. Jalen let his words sink in, then turned to the jury. I don't want your sympathy, he told them. I want your awareness. Because today it was me standing here, fighting for my freedom. Tomorrow, it could be someone else. Someone who doesn't know the law, who doesn't have the ability to fight back. A woman in the jury dabbed her eyes with a tissue. A man in the front row nodded solemnly. And in the gallery, Jalen saw his mother, Denise Carter, standing proudly. She had spent years teaching him about the legal system, its flaws, its biases, and its potential for change. And today he had shown the world that knowledge was power. Judge Grayson exhaled heavily, then cleared his throat. The court will take a recess, he announced. I will review the claims being made and— You don't need a recess, Jalen said, cutting him off. You need to do what's right. Right now. Grayson's hands tightened on the bench. For a moment he seemed like he was going to push back, cling to his authority. But there was no way out of this. The evidence was damning. The media was watching. And for once in his career he knew he had lost. With a slow, measured breath he nodded stiffly. The case against Jalen Carter is hereby dismissed, he said, his voice clipped. You are free to go. The words hit like a thunderclap. The courtroom erupted. Reporters scrambled, cameras flashed, and the gallery broke into murmurs. But Jalen didn't move. Not right away. He stood there, absorbing the moment, feeling the weight of victory settle over him. Then, with calm precision, he gathered his papers, turned his back to the judge, and walked out. But before he could leave, Judge Grayson called after him. Carter. Jalen paused but didn't turn around. There was a hesitation in Grayson's voice that hadn't been there before. You should consider law school, the judge muttered. Jalen let out a quiet chuckle, shaking his head as he stepped through the courtroom doors. He didn't need to consider it. He was already on his way. The auditorium at Howard University School of Law was packed. Students, faculty, and legal professionals had gathered for a special guest speaker. Jalen Carter stood at the podium, looking out at a sea of young, eager faces. 1 year ago, he had stood in a courtroom, fighting for his freedom. Now, he was standing in front of future lawyers, judges, and change-makers. He exhaled and began his speech. I spent my whole life being told I had to work twice as hard to get half as far. I watched a justice system that failed people like me every single day. And I knew, even before I was arrested, that if I wanted things to change, I had to fight for it. He scanned the crowd, meeting their gazes. The law isn't just about power. It's about who controls the narrative. And for too long we've let the wrong people tell our stories. He gestured to the students before him. But not anymore. The audience erupted into applause, and as Jalen stepped away from the podium, his mother watching proudly from the front row, he knew. This was only the beginning. This story isn't just about Jalen Carter. It's about every innocent person who was railroaded by a system designed to convict, not seek justice. How many lives have been ruined because of false accusations? How many people have been forced into plea deals, not because they were guilty, but because they didn't have the resources to fight? The system won't change on its own. We have to change it. If this story made you think, share it, spread awareness. Because next time it might not be Jalen. It might be someone you love,